Thank you for joining us for our next installment of our small group study. Chad, would you read for us?
Yeah, we're going to start in 1 Corinthians 10:23. All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor.
Well, we have, looking at the letters to the church at Corinth, there's some differences here between some of the other letters that Paul writes, and the occasion for writing is not quite the typical one for Paul, in the fact that it's not the problem of kind of Judaizers coming in and causing us problems within the church, but it's really more of a problem with the church's own internal conflicts, and the results of the church being in the setting of let's say a kind of a pagan culture, and the influences that pagan culture has on the church. When we look at the letter of 1 Corinthians, really Paul's addressing a number of things in the church that are going poorly, and so there seems to be some divisions within the church, and what's happening there as far as those divisions are concerned.
I think we alluded to these last week, and some are saying I'm of Paul, and I'm of Apollos, and I'm of Cephas, and kind of using those as sources of pride, and for whatever reason, it reminds me of when the disciples are arguing about who's the greatest, and it's like, oh, that's not the point here, guys, and they're kind of getting lost on the point here as well, and these issues of pride are causing division in the congregation.
It seems to me that when you look at this, there's an issue here of kind of the way that the world deals with things. That's not unlike some of the problems with the Galatian church, although theirs were kind of rooted back into really the Jewish experience. In the Gentile world, this is a problem as well, where we don't necessarily trace things back to God, but we trace things back to some human teacher or something like that. And there's a need to justify ourselves. There's a need to glorify ourselves. And we choose a train of thought, a school of thought. We choose a teacher or a leader based on that. And so how does the church then, because this is such a big human tendency, how does the church fight that?
I think you have to remember, I think exactly what you said, you trace it all the way back to God, and it's funny because this came up with the study on Galatians with my group, and I talked about, if we saw people in our church being like, well, I got introduced to Jesus through Josh Gaddy. Oh, no, well, I got introduced to Jesus through Mark Marshall. This would just sound ridiculous, but this is kind of what's going on, and it's not who you got introduced to Jesus through, it's that you got introduced to Jesus. And the same thing here, we have to fight, through what human agency we might have, come to saving faith, and it's all about knowing Jesus. And if you make it about, who you came to through, you've made it something far less.
Yeah, it kind of shows the problem with pride, because there's a need. Pride drives us to need to distinguish ourselves from other people. And what's the problem with that in terms of a covenant relationship?
The covenant, you have this, exchange of identities to where you're seeking the other's good, at least to an equal footing, if not even a higher footing of seeking your own. But this pride is totally counter to that and works completely against it.
One of the things that the church at Corinth is dealing with is it's dealing with kind of the ancient pagan world's mores on sex, and how the church is going to deal with that. And what's Paul's concern in this regard with the church at Corinth?
Well, I guess the issue at hand is that somebody in the church has actually taken his father's wife. And Paul's like, this isn't even done in pagan cultures, and this is happening in the church. But he's worried. He talks about the whole leaven analogy, that a little leaven leavens the whole lump, and he's afraid that this is going to be something that actually contaminates the entire congregation.
Yeah, and I think that there's a problem that we often encounter where the idea of grace can be misconstrued as the idea of kind of not having boundaries at all. What's the problem with that mistake? If in the end I'm found kind of not guilty, does it matter whether I'm found not guilty because there's no rule or whether I'm found not guilty because of grace?
So absolutely, and I think we have to remember that God displays His great grace on us, and then glorifies us. And in the one case, when we have the proper boundaries and display grace and forgiveness for the purpose of glorifying somebody, that doesn't mean we just continue to let them revel in their sin because we just say there's no rules. That does not lead to their glorification, and quite the opposite.
So one of the big issues that Paul addresses in this letter is the issue of food, which seems strange to us, but yet in Scripture, food is an issue over and over again, and it's kind of maybe a symbol of a larger issue. And so, what is the issue that with food that the Church at Corinth is having, and what does it kind of represent that's maybe a little bit bigger and broader?
So the issue they're having is, like say we look at the Hebrew sacrifices, we can kind of get focused on the sacrifice and forget that, but after the sacrifice, that animal was eaten. And this happens in the pagan circles as well, where they're sacrificing to idols. And then that food is sold in the marketplaces. And the issue is, like, should we even eat food that's been sacrificed to an idol? And Paul's like, well, in an absolute sense, like, there's no such thing as an idol. However, if your weak brother over here thinks that it is something and sees you eating it, you might cause him to, violate his own conscience by your behavior. And so the bigger issue is, are we doing all things for the edification of the body and all things for the glory of God? Or are we looking at pleasing ourselves as being the primacy?
Yeah, and I think that this is kind of a microcosm of this larger issue, that really what the Church at Corinth needs to understand is that they have a covenant relationship with God that puts them in covenant relationship with the other believers around them, and that this makes a change of living kind of a requirement. You can't go on living as if you weren't in the covenant anymore. Just like if you get married, you don't go on living as a single person. They seem to be having some trouble adjusting to this new reality that they're in. Is that something that's just a problem with the Church at Corinth? And what is it that kind of causes this misunderstanding?
It's definitely not unique to the Church at Corinth, and I think it's funny, you can read Acts chapter 2 and the birth of the church and get this idea that, the church was amazing and it was never had problems, and I'm glad we get a little bigger window into some of the other churches here to see this, but I think this goes right back to the nature of seeking our own good above seeking the good of others, and maybe sometimes at the expense of seeking the good of others, and in living in covenant, that's just not compatible. And seeking the good of those you're in covenant with, of the group as a whole, even sometimes to a greater extent than seeking your own, is what's required.
Paul will then move into kind of what happens when the people gather together to worship, and some of the issues with that. So how does this idea of covenant play into the worship service?
And again, he even talks here about let all things be done for the edification of the body. And he makes this analogy to the body and things of his sort, and just goes to great length, and it seems like they were even having some issues of maybe pride here in the display of spiritual gifts, and once again, that makes it all about you and not all about the group that you're in covenant with. And Paul really tries to take that focus off and kind of check that right where it's at and make it all about the edification of the body.